The house had learned to trust the smile. It was the kind of smile that asked nothing and promised less. Soft at the corners, lowered at the eyes. In the year 1854, such a smile was considered a blessing in a servant, and in a slave, a mercy. It passed unchallenged through corridors heavy with oil, lamp smoke, and inherited power, through rooms where men spoke loudly, because they believed no one listened. He entered the dining room just before sunset, carrying the soup tureen as though it weighed nothing at all. The silver lid trembled only once before he steadied it. No one noticed. They were already arguing. About land, about debts, about which names should never be spoken aloud again. The servant stood patiently at the wall, waiting for a pause that never quite came. When he served, he did so with care. Not the exaggerated care of fear, but something gentler. Intentional. He remembered who preferred more salt, who disliked to be looked at directly, who flinched at sudden movement. He remembered things he had never been taught. A drop of broth splashed onto the tablecloth. He apologized softly. The master waved him away without looking. The cloth would be changed later. Everything could be replaced. As the meal progressed, the air thickened, not with smoke or heat, but with unease no one could name. A wife paused mid-bite, suddenly uncertain why her hands were shaking. A guest laughed too loudly, then fell silent, eyes following the servant as he moved behind their chairs. Each time he passed, it felt as though something had been quietly adjusted, like a lock turned one careful notch. He smiled whenever he was addressed. He smiled even when he wasn't. By the time dessert was served, night had settled fully around the house. Candles guttered. Outside, the cicadas went abruptly still. Someone remarked on the quiet, and another replied that it was nothing at all. The servant poured the final drink with steady hands, his reflection briefly visible in the dark surface of the glass. His smile did not waver. It had work yet to do. By morning, the house would no longer recognize itself. The assignment came quietly, as such things always did, folded into routine so seamlessly that no one thought to question it. The household was accustomed to giving orders without explanation and receiving obedience without delay. And so when word passed down that he was to serve the private dinner that evening, it carried the weight of inevitability rather than importance. Yet within the walls of the house, this was no ordinary meal. It was a gathering reserved for voices that shaped fortunes and erased names, a table where decisions were made that never appeared in ink. To be chosen to serve it was not a reward, but a test of invisibility. He received the instruction in the service corridor, where the light barely reached and footsteps were softened by years of wear. There was no eye contact, no confirmation sought. The overseer spoke his name once, flat and efficient, then moved on. The expectation was clear. Appear when summoned, move when needed, vanish when done. He bowed his head in acknowledgement, the gesture automatic, practiced since childhood. Those watching would have seen only submission. They would not have noticed the stillness beneath it. Preparation began hours before the guests arrived. He washed his hands longer than necessary, scrubbing beneath the nails until the skin reddened. He straightened his jacket, smoothing fabric already smooth, aligning seams no one would examine. Each motion was deliberate, not rushed, as though time itself had slowed to accommodate him. In the kitchen, others worked around him, tense and whispering. They knew this dinner mattered. They knew mistakes would be punished. Yet he moved among them with an unsettling calm, accepting dishes, testing their weight, memorizing their order. The smile appeared early, settling onto his face as naturally as breath. It was not wide, not false, but gentle enough to disarm suspicion. In this house, a smiling servant was considered a good one. A smiling slave was considered harmless. The smile had been learned over years, shaped by necessity, refined through observation. He knew precisely how much warmth it should convey, how quickly it should fade when not needed. It was armor disguised as courtesy. When the dining room was prepared, he entered alone to inspect it, though no one had asked him to. The long table gleamed under candlelight, polished until it reflected the ceiling beams like dark water. Chairs stood in rigid formation, each one assigned by rank and resentment. He walked the perimeter slowly, counting steps, noting which boards creaked and which did not. He adjusted a place setting by a fraction of an inch, aligning it with something only he could see. The significance of his assignment lay not in the labor, but in the proximity. To serve this table was to stand close enough to power to hear it breathe. It meant pouring wine while secrets were spoken, clearing plates while grudges resurfaced. It meant becoming part of the room's architecture, seen, yet not acknowledged as human. That assumption, so deeply rooted, was what made the assignment dangerous, though no one but him understood why. As dusk approached, the first guests arrived, their carriages crunching over gravel like distant thunder. Voices carried through the hall, confident and careless. He positioned himself near the sideboard, hands folded, posture flawless. When addressed, he responded softly. When ignored, he remained motionless. The smile never faltered. It was offered to everyone equally, without favoritism or fear. Those seated at the table did not know why his presence unsettled them. One man cleared his throat more often than necessary. Another frowned at his glass, convinced it had been filled differently before. A woman glanced up sharply, certain she had been watched. To none of them spoke of it. To acknowledge discomfort would be to admit awareness of him, and awareness was a boundary they did not cross. The master of the house observed him briefly, assessing posture and pace, then dismissed him from thought entirely. That dismissal was complete and sincere. In it lay the greatest mistake. The servant had been reduced to function, stripped of intention, rendered safe by assumption alone. He served the first course with precision, stepping forward at the exact moment conversation lulled, retreating before it resumed. His calm was not the calm of resignation, but of readiness, like a held breath that could last far longer than expected. Every movement reinforced the illusion that he belonged exactly where they believed he did. Below notice, beneath consequence. By the time the candles were fully lit and the doors closed, the assignment had already begun to fulfill its purpose. Not because he acted, but because he was there, smiling, listening, absorbing the shape of the night as it unfolded, gathering what would be needed later, when the house slept and the illusion finally loosened its grip, and the smile, still intact, waited patiently for what would follow. The irregularities began so small that they could have been dismissed as nerves or coincidence. The sort of discomfort that often accompanied private dinners, where power gathered too closely. At first, it was only a hesitation in his movements, so slight it bordered on imagined. When he poured the wine, he paused for a breath longer than etiquette required, as if considering the glass before committing to the act. The liquid never spilled, never reached the rim. Yet something about the pause unsettled the man watching, who shifted in his chair and cleared his throat without knowing why. He seemed to know when to appear. Not merely summoned by a bell or a glance, but anticipating needs before they were expressed. A fork slipped from a woman's fingers, striking the table with a sharp sound, and he was already there, replacing it with another, clean and polished, before the echo had fully died. She stared at him, startled, then laughed it off, blaming her clumsiness. His smile met hers calmly, as though he had expected the moment all along. As conversation deepened and voices lowered, He adjusted his distance with unnatural precision. He never stood too close, never far enough to seem inattentive. When certain topics arose, old property lines, past labor disputes, a name spoken with caution, he lingered just long enough to hear, then drifted away, carrying plates that no longer held food. No one questioned how often he passed behind them during these moments. They only felt the faint pressure of his presence, like a shadow that didn't quite match the candlelight. His eyes were another irregularity, though few could have said why. They did not wander, as one might expect, nor did they remain fixed on the floor. Instead, they lifted briefly at moments of tension, meeting gazes with an openness that felt inappropriate, then lowering again before challenge could form. Each glance seemed accidental, yet each landed with uncanny accuracy, as though he knew precisely when someone was most vulnerable to being seen. A man at the table remarked that the room felt warmer than usual, loosening his collar and blaming the fire. Another disagreed, claiming a draft crept in from somewhere unseen. The servant moved to adjust a curtain that had not shifted, smoothing it flat with a careful hand. The temperature did not change, yet the argument dissolved, replaced by an uneasy silence that stretched longer than comfort allowed. When he spoke, it was only when addressed, and his words were few, polite, and correct. Still, there was something in his tone that lingered after he finished, as though the sound itself carried weight. A simple acknowledgement seemed to echo, drawing attention back to what had just been said at the table. A denial spoken moments later felt weaker, less convincing, and the speaker frowned, uncertain why his own voice no longer satisfied him. Small disruptions accumulated. A glass placed slightly off-center. A chair nudged just enough to alter posture. A candle trimmed lower on one side than the other, causing shadows to stretch unevenly across familiar faces. Each change was insignificant alone, but together they altered the room's rhythm. Conversation stumbled where it had flowed. Laughter arrived a beat too late or ended too abruptly. The house, so carefully controlled, seemed to breathe differently. They began to notice him more, though not consciously. Someone followed his movement with their eyes, then looked away quickly, embarrassed by the instinct. Another addressed him twice in the same sentence, forgetting he had already responded. A woman hesitated before speaking, glancing toward the wall, as if expecting him to be there, though he stood behind her chair instead. The awareness of him hovered just below acknowledgement, like a word on the tip of the tongue that could not be spoken. He never broke the rules they believed governed him. He did not interrupt, did not linger without purpose, did not allow his smile to fade. That obedience made the irregularities more disturbing, not less. There was no open defiance to confront, no mistake to correct. Only the creeping sense that something unseen was being rearranged while they watched. At one point, a guest accused another of misremembering an agreement made years before. Voices rose. The servant stepped forward to refill a glass, and as he did, he murmured an apology for the interruption, his voice soft and sincere. The argument faltered. Both men fell silent, each suddenly uncertain of his own recollection, each convinced the other looked somehow changed. The servant withdrew, leaving behind a quiet that felt deliberate. By the time the main course was cleared, the table no longer felt solid. Trust thinned, not through revelation, but through doubt seeded gently and repeatedly. Each person sensed that the evening was slipping from familiar ground, though nothing concrete had occurred to justify the feeling. The servant continued his work, smiling, precise, attentive, and in the subtle imbalance he cultivated through gesture and timing alone, the first fractures had formed, invisible but widening, as the dinner progressed toward a conclusion none of them yet understood. And he did, without haste, without error, without ever allowing the smallest crack in the expression that told them he was exactly what they believed him to be, waiting, listening, knowing, and quietly ensuring that what felt wrong could no longer be ignored by anyone seated at the table, even as they tried to convince themselves that nothing at all had changed. Night settled over the house with deceptive gentleness, the kind that softened edges and encouraged confidences. Lamps were lowered, voices followed, and the gathering drew inward, convinced that what had already been said was the most dangerous it could become. Yet as darkness pressed against the windows, the servant's influence deepened, no longer confined to the table, but moving through the relationships seated around it like a slow infection. What had begun as unease now matured into suspicion, and suspicion, once invited, needed little encouragement to speak. It started with a remark delivered too casually to be harmless. One guest, leaning back with a glass balanced loosely in his hand, repeated a phrase spoken earlier in the evening, but altered just enough to change its meaning. He laughed as he said it, claiming poor memory, yet his eyes searched the faces around him. The man he addressed stiffened, insisting he had never spoken those words, not in that order, not with that intent. The denial was quick, rehearsed, and it landed poorly. Silence followed, thick and expectant. The servant appeared then, as if drawn by the pause itself. He moved to clear a plate, his presence quiet but undeniable. As he leaned in, he shifted the glass on the table slightly, turning it so that the candlelight revealed a smear along its rim. The guest who had laughed noticed it and frowned, suddenly uncertain how much he had drunk. His confidence wavered. The man he had accused watched closely, noting the hesitation, storing it away. Elsewhere at the table, a woman spoke more sharply than intended, correcting another's recollection of a past agreement. The correction was small, almost polite, but it struck deep. The other woman flushed, offended not by the contradiction, but by the implication that her memory was unreliable. She glanced instinctively toward the servant, who stood nearby refilling water, his face composed, his eyes lowered. The glance went unanswered, yet the damage was done. Doubt, once planted, required no further tending. As the evening wore on, these moments multiplied. Someone referenced a letter that another insisted had never existed. A debt was mentioned, then dismissed, then raised again with a different figure attached. Each discrepancy felt personal, accusatory, even when no accusation was voiced. Old alliances strained under the weight of too many inconsistencies. Long-standing partnerships, built on shared benefit rather than trust, revealed how brittle they truly were. The servant did not speak unless spoken to, yet his movements punctuated each fracture. He lingered behind one chair longer than necessary, just as an uncomfortable topic arose. He withdrew from another, leaving a speaker exposed and suddenly unsure of the room's mood. He refilled glasses selectively, not by favoritism but by timing, ensuring that certain individuals felt clearer, headed while others felt dulled, their own words sounding distant even to themselves. Whispers began to travel down the table. Not secrets yet, but clarifications, corrections, quiet questions. Did you hear what he said earlier? Are you certain that was the arrangement? I recall it differently. These murmurs overlapped and contradicted, creating a low hum of uncertainty beneath the conversation. The servant passed through it like a steady current, unaffected, attentive, smiling. One man, sensing the shift, attempted to reassert control. He raised his voice, steered the discussion back to safer ground, invoked shared history and mutual gain. For a moment, it worked. Laughter returned, forced but functional. The room exhaled. Then the servant placed a document beside him, one he had been asked to retrieve hours earlier, its presence long forgotten. The man glanced down, recognized it, and faltered mid-sentence. The paper should not have been there yet. Someone else noticed the break, followed his gaze, and leaned forward to read a name they had hoped never to see again. The servant apologized softly for the interruption. The apology felt pointed, though it was not. The conversation splintered anew, this time along fault lines that had been buried for years. Accusations emerged, cautiously phrased, then sharpened by repetition. Each speaker believed they were responding to something already said, though no one could recall precisely when. The night stretched, elastic and disorienting. By now no one fully ignored the servant, yet no one addressed him directly about what was happening. To do so would be to acknowledge his role, and that recognition remained unthinkable. Instead, they watched him from the corners of their eyes, measuring his distance, his timing, his smile. Each glance increased the tension, each unspoken thought widening the rift between them. Trust eroded, not through revelation, but through the relentless suggestion that something essential had already been betrayed. Allies questioned each other's motives. Friends reconsidered shared victories. The servant moved quietly among them, clearing remnants of the meal, removing physical evidence of nourishment, even as he stripped away the illusion of unity. By the time the last dish was carried out and the doors were closed against the night, the room was no longer a gathering, but a collection of isolated figures bound together only by mutual unease, each convinced that the others knew more than they were saying, each certain that the evening had shifted in a way that could not be undone. As the servant took his place once more at the wall, smiling, still, and surrounded by the silent aftermath of everything he had not said, yet somehow caused, and as the lamps burned lower, and the first true confessions hovered just beyond the threshold of speech, waiting for the smallest encouragement to finally emerge. Before dawn, the house began to speak in a different language, one stripped of caution and ceremony. The fractures that had formed through the night widened, under the weight of exhaustion and fear, and what had once been carefully guarded memories now pressed urgently toward the surface. The servant was no longer needed to guide the conversation. It unraveled on its own, driven by the gnawing sense that concealment had already failed. Each person sensed that the silence they had relied upon for years was no longer protective, but accusatory. It started with an admission disguised as a defense. One man, pale and unsteady, insisted that a particular decision had never been his to make, that he had merely signed what others prepared. His voice shook not with guilt, he claimed, but with indignation. Another laughed sharply at this, reminding him of a night long past when the decision had been debated in this very house, with witnesses now conveniently forgotten. The memory surfaced with unsettling clarity, details sharpening, as if time itself had conspired to preserve them for this moment alone. The servant stood near the doorway, hands folded, listening. He did not intervene, yet his presence seemed to draw the truth closer, as though the walls themselves leaned inward to hear. A woman rose from her chair, unable to remain seated as accusations shifted toward her family. She denied involvement, then corrected herself, then fell silent, realizing too late that the correction revealed more than denial ever could. The room reacted immediately, voices overlapping, each seizing upon the slip as proof of deeper deceit. Old crimes emerged not as singular revelations, but as a pattern too consistent to dismiss. Land seized under false pretenses. Records altered, then burned. Labor extracted through threats that never reached paper, but left marks on bodies and minds alike. Each confession, reluctant or defiant, invited another, until the air felt heavy with things that had never been meant to be spoken aloud. What made it Unbearable was not the cruelty of the acts themselves, but the recognition that everyone present had benefited from them in some way, directly or by silence. Someone attempted to reframe the past, arguing that such actions were necessary, that they reflected the customs of the time. The defense rang hollow even as it was spoken. Another interrupted, pointing out that necessity had always favored the same hands, the same names. The argument escalated, turning personal, dredging up betrayals layered atop the original sins. Partnerships once considered unbreakable now appeared transactional, maintained only as long as secrets remained buried. The servant moved through the chaos with measured steps, clearing glasses that had long gone untouched. Each removal felt symbolic, stripping away comfort as the night deepened. At one point, he placed a candle closer to the center of the table, its light exposing faces slick with sweat and anger. No one questioned the adjustment. The illumination revealed expressions they had never intended to share. Fear etched plainly where confidence once lived. As dawn approached, desperation replaced caution. One man proposed destroying remaining evidence, speaking of ledgers and correspondence hidden beyond the house. Another recoiled, realizing that such destruction would implicate them all. The suggestion itself was an admission, and it hung in the air like smoke. Alliances collapsed under the weight of self-preservation. Accusations sharpened into threats, not of violence, but of exposure, the most dangerous weapon among those who had built their lives on erasure. The servant listened as names were spoken that had not been uttered in years, names of those displaced, broken, or buried quietly. With each name, the house seemed to recoil, its beams creaking faintly as if in protest. The realization dawned that these crimes were not isolated moments, but a foundation, and that the structure built upon them could not stand once acknowledged. The night's confessions did not cleanse, they corroded, eating away at any remaining justification. Someone noticed then that the servant had stopped smiling. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it unsettled the room more than any raised voice. His expression was not triumphant, not cruel, merely attentive. He had become a witness rather than a participant, and that shift carried its own judgment. Words faltered. The speakers became acutely aware of how much had already been revealed, and how little could now be taken back. As the first hint of morning light crept through the windows, the room stood exposed, filled with people who no longer trusted one another, bound together by knowledge that could not be contained. The servant returned to his place by the wall, his role once again unobtrusive, yet the damage was complete. What had been unearthed could not be buried again, not by fire, not by force, not by silence. And as the house awaited dawn, heavy with the weight of its own history, the final collapse lingered just beyond sight. Inevitable, patient, and already in motion, morning arrived without ceremony, slipping into the house as if reluctant to be seen. The light crept along the floorboards and climbed the walls, revealing what the night had done with cruel precision. Faces looked older, harsher, stripped of the careful expressions that had once protected them. No one spoke at first. They waited, not for forgiveness or relief, but for something to make sense of what had already been lost. It was then that they noticed the servant was gone. At first, the absence seemed insignificant, another detail swallowed by exhaustion. A chair remained pushed back where he had last stood. A folded cloth lay untouched on the sideboard. Someone called his name without conviction, more out of habit than concern. There was no answer. The house, which had echoed with accusation and confession hours earlier, offered only silence in return. As they moved through the rooms, searching, the full extent of the night's damage became impossible to ignore. Doors stood ajar where they were always kept closed. A cabinet had been emptied, its contents scattered not chaotically, but deliberately, as if arranged to be found. Papers long believed destroyed lay stacked neatly on a desk, their edges aligned, their ink unmistakable in the morning light. Each document carried dates, signatures, transactions that told a story no one could deny, now that it was written plainly before them. Panic surfaced, sharp and immediate. Voices rose again, this time not in argument but in disbelief. How had these records survived? Who had accessed them? Who had known where to look? The realization struck almost simultaneously. The servant had known. He had known not through privilege, but through proximity, through years spent listening while being ignored, watching while being dismissed. What had seemed like invisibility had been access. Outside, the grounds told their own story. Gates stood open. Tracks marked the damp earth, leading away from the house toward the road. No hurried escape had taken place. The path was steady, unbroken, as though whoever walked it had done so without fear of pursuit. The knowledge that he had left on his own terms unsettled them more than the idea of flight ever could. Within hours, the consequences began to arrive. A messenger appeared at the gate bearing news that spread through the house like a second dawn, harsh and unforgiving. Authorities were asking questions. Names were circulating. Whispers that once died within these walls had found voices elsewhere. The documents, copied and distributed before anyone realized they were missing, had already begun their work. What had been carefully contained was now impossible to retrieve. The house itself seemed to respond to the shift. A beam cracked in the upper hall. A window shattered without explanation, the sound echoing through rooms already hollowed by fear. Servants who had remained through the night began to leave, quietly at first, then openly, unwilling to bind themselves to a place that no longer promised protection. The hierarchy that had governed every interaction dissolved with startling speed. Those who remained turned on one another with renewed intensity, each desperate to deflect blame, to claim ignorance, to assert control over a narrative that no longer belonged to them. Former allies became liabilities. Family names, once shields, now attracted scrutiny. Every shared glance carried accusation. Every silence implied guilt. The unity that had once defined the household lay in ruins, replaced by self-preservation and regret. As the sun climbed higher, the destruction became undeniable. Financial networks unraveled as partners withdrew, unwilling to be associated with scandal. Legal threats mounted. Social invitations vanished. The house, once a symbol of permanence and power, stood exposed as a monument to crimes that could no longer be obscured by tradition or time. Its walls, thick with history, offered no defense against the reckoning they now faced. No one spoke the servant's name aloud again. To do so would be to acknowledge how thoroughly he had dismantled them without force, without violence, without ever raising his voice. His smile, once dismissed as harmless, lingered in memory like an accusation, a reminder of how easily they had mistaken obedience for submission. By afternoon, the house was nearly empty. Those who left did so hurriedly, carrying what they could, avoiding one another's eyes. Those who stayed remained rooted in place, staring at evidence they could no longer deny, listening to the distant sounds of a world closing in. The servant was already far beyond their reach, not as a fugitive, but as a witness who had delivered truth, where it would do the most damage. The destruction he left behind was not dramatic in a single moment, but total in its reach, erasing influence, dismantling reputations, collapsing a legacy built on silence and suffering. What stood in the wake of his departure was not justice neatly served, but something more enduring and more terrifying: exposure. Irreversible and complete. stretching forward into days and years that would carry the consequences of that single night. Long after the house itself fell quiet, its power broken, its story finally told, and its mourning marked forever by the absence of the one they had believed incapable of changing anything at all.